Bancroft Nora Rehab welcomes you to our Heads Up webinar series. Today's program is Disability as Diversity, Developing Cultural Competence. Now I will turn the presentation over to today's speaker, Dr. Sheryl Berardinelli, a senior neuropsychologist at Bancroft Nora Rehab, who is board certified in rehabilitation psychology.
Hi, good afternoon. I have nothing to disclose. At the end of this webinar, I hope that our listeners will be able to explain the importance of disability as a diversity variable in psychology, to describe the disability culture, ableism, microaggressions, and the various models of disability, to discover ways to develop disability cultural competence and awareness, and to be able to describe disability affirmative therapy. So it's helpful to review important disability-related legislation in our country to gain a deeper understanding of how societal attitudes have changed over the years, as well as to appreciate the experiences of people with disability and the foundation of the disability culture and identity. Much of the earliest activism in the disability community came from deaf and blind individuals. It's probably not a surprise to many to hear that the history of disability in this country is a mix of things that are encouraging and progressive, but some of them are also deeply disturbing things. In the early 1800s, a blind Frenchman named Louis-Jean-Philippe Braille developed the race point alphabet system named after him. This was introduced in the United States in the 1860s and was officially adopted in 1932, and later it became a widely used system for reading and writing for the blind. In many countries around the 19th century, including America, an uncomfortable part of this disability history includes displaying individuals with disabilities as exhibits in sideshows or freak shows. This is an example of objectification and dehumanization of persons with disability. During the American Civil War, this resulted in extensive injuries among the soldiers, and many of them sustained disabilities as a result of this, most prominently in amputations and psychological problems, or PTSD, before the term PTSD was coined. A positive thing, though, that came out of the Civil War is that it began providing help and support to injured and disabled soldiers after the war, and also helping them to reintegrate into the society. So the idea of providing disability benefits began during this time. At the same time, many Americans who were not in military service were also acquiring disability because of the industrialization of labor. So society began to view disability as both a social and economic problem. Unfortunately, the response at that time was to institutionalize people with disability. After the First World War, disability issues came to the forefront again as more service members sustained disabilities during the war. During the Depression in 1932, veterans demonstrated in Washington, D.C. to advocate for cash payment benefits. And to this day, a lot of the civilian disability policies are strongly influenced by legislation originally enacted for veterans. The 1918 Smith-Sears Veterans Rehabilitation Act was the first federal legislation to offer rehab services to injured service members. Not long after that, the Smith-Vest Act, also known as the Civilian Vocational Rehabilitation Act, allowed the federal government to match the state funds to provide rehab services to people with disability whose injuries were not sustained during the military service. So a positive change that came out of the First World War was the movement to rehabilitate people with disability, and the idea that having a disability meant you cannot work was being challenged. In 1935, FDR signed the Social Security Act, which expanded funding for vocational rehab programs and care for the elderly and children with disabilities. But again, as good as these things sound, the disability rights progress was not linear. United States was the first country to legalize compulsory sterilization for eugenic purposes, particularly targeting individuals with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, deafness, blindness, epilepsy, and other diagnoses. In 1907, Indiana was the first state to legalize compulsory sterilization. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sex, or national origin. What group is missing in this? People with disabilities. Some said that the disability rights are more complicated than racial or gender equality because it's not just about changing one's attitude or society's attitude about it. It also involves architectural and infrastructural changes, which were deemed too expensive. And this eventually led to the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968 that addressed limited accessibility in federal buildings. The 1970s was viewed as the most productive decade in the civil rights for people with disability in the United States. During this time, the movement to stop institutionalizing people with disability became louder and gained more public support and traction. In 1977, the Section 504 regulations were issued. In 1990, George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is the civil rights legislation to protect people with disabilities. The ADA was amended in 2008, and it corrected some problems identified with the original ADA. So it broadened and clarified the definition of disability, which had been criticized as too vague. The amendment also specifies that mitigating factors such as assistive devices cannot be used in the determination of disability. So for example, if a person with an amputation is able to walk because they're using prosthetics, that in of itself should not be a reason that they're denied having disability or access to disability benefits because of that. The new law also allows for conditions or health diagnosis that have more of an episodic presentation with the symptoms waxing and waning, rather than considering only the person's functioning at the time of a possible ADA infraction. And then the Affordable Care Act in 2010 expanded coverage for people with disability with pre-existing conditions. So, before we go further, let's define what is disability. The ADA defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities of such individual. There's a record of such impairment and being regarded as having such impairment. According to the CDC, a disability is any condition of the body or mind, that's the impairment, that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities. So there's an activity limitation and interact with the world around them. And now this one is talking about participation restrictions. It is important to remember that in the context of the ADA, disability is a legal term rather than a medical one. Because it has a legal definition, the ADA's definition of disability is different from how disability is defined under some other laws, such as for the Social Security disability-related benefits. There are many types of disabilities that may affect a person's functioning. These may include their vision, movement, thinking, remembering or their memory, their learning abilities, communication, hearing, mental health, social relationships. There's no single definition, and disability exists on a continuum. Other key concepts that would be helpful for us to understand as we talk about disability as diversity include the following terms that often show up in the literature. So we've talked about disability. When people read about handicap, what this is referring to is the disadvantage for any given individual in a society that results from the disability. Impairment talks about any loss or abnormality of physiological, psychological, or anatomical structure or function. So for example, muscle paralysis is the impairment due to a diagnosis of polio. The disability here is mobility limitations. The handicap may be in the form of physical, which may include inaccessible venues. It may be a social handicap, such as the stigma by other people. It could be an economic handicap, when a person has to pay out of pocket for housing modifications, for example. It could be a legal handicap, like the frequency of people without disabilities using handicapped parking placards, or political handicap, not just the lack of representation of people with disabilities in government and agencies that have an influence or voice in making policies. Ableism refers to the prejudice against people with disability and discrimination in favor of able-bodied people that disadvantages those with disabilities. It might be deliberate, such as websites refusing to make their companies refusing to make their websites compatible with screen readers for the blind, or it could be unintentional, like when you go to the store and they put merchandise in front of the handicap dressing room, or sometimes they could even be well-intentioned. So, when you go to lecture halls or movie theaters, they often have an accessible, wheelchair accessible area, but it's often in the back. So, it still restricts the choices or access for people with disability. This ableism talks about like rendering a person with disability at a disadvantage due to the environment designs that assume able-bodied norms. It includes the presumption that everyone is able-bodied and creates environment physically and socially that are not accessible to people with disability. Internalized ableism is the internalized oppression or the adoption of negative beliefs and attitudes about one's own group. So, for example, a person with disability believes that the group that they belong to is inferior. Often the goal of someone with a high degree of internalized ableism is to dissociate with the group of people with disability and try to pass or be accepted as non-disabled in the mainstream group. People without disability may not fully appreciate or acknowledge that negative attitudes about people with disability exist, in part because many of these harmful attitudes are not expressed openly or come across as openly hostile. It's more subtle, indirect, and ironically, sometimes may even be presented in the form of a compliment. Generally speaking, when someone has an openly hostile and hateful behavior toward people with disability, it's frowned upon. People with disability are stereotypically viewed as vulnerable and weak, much like how society views children and the elderly. So if you see someone showing explicit discrimination or aggression toward a person with disability, that person is often labeled as cruel. But people with disabilities encounter many different forms of attitudinal barriers. And these are some examples. Inferiority. Because a person may be impaired in one of life's major functions, some people believe that they're a second-class citizen. But for most people, with disabilities, they have skills that make the impairment moot in the workplace. Pity. People feel sorry for the person with disability, which may lead to patronizing attitudes. In general, people with disability don't want pity and charity. They just seek equal opportunity to earn their own way and live independently. Hero worship, or sometimes in the literature it's referred to as inspiration porn. People consider someone with a disability who lives independently, or if they're working, or if they are in a relationship, if they're married, like there's something brave or special for overcoming a disability. But most people with disabilities, they don't want accolades for performing day-to-day tasks or things that seem mundane. The disability is there, and the individual has simply learned to adapt by using their skills and knowledge, just as everybody adapts to other physical characteristics that they may have. There's the spread effect. So people assume that an individual's disability negatively affects other parts of who they are. There's like a globalization of this one impairment. It may, person may see that one disability and assume that the totality of the person is also impaired. So some examples of this, like if you see someone like raising their voice or almost shouting at a person who's blind, even though that person's hearing is unaffected. Backlash. Many people believe individuals with disabilities are given unfair advantages, such as easier work requirements. That's not true. Employers need to hold people with disabilities to the same job standards as their coworkers, though the means of accomplishing the task may be different from person to person. The ADA does not require special privileges for people with disabilities, just equal opportunities. Denial. Many disabilities are hidden, such as learning disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, epilepsy, cancer, arthritis, heart conditions, brain injuries. People tend to believe that these are not bona fide disabilities needing accommodation. The ADA defines disability as an impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities. Accommodating hidden disabilities, which meet the above definition, can keep valued employees on the job and open doors for new employees. Fear. Many people are afraid that they will do or say the wrong thing around someone with a disability. So sometimes they will avoid their own discomfort by just avoiding the individual. As with meeting a person from a different culture, the more we have encounters and interactions, it can raise our comfort level. So these are symbols that are often used in the disability community. The one on the top left is the International Symbol of Access. This was designed by a Danish person named Susan Kofod in the 1960s. It was designed during a conference, and this symbol represents the removal of environmental barriers to people with disability, particularly wheelchair users. So for example, when you see this sign, it usually means that the steps have been removed or that they've provided curb cuts or with like handicap ramps, which are helpful not just for people with disability, but also parents with strollers, travelers with suitcases, the elderly. So the International Symbol of Access can also be seen in parking spaces, reserved for vehicles used by people with disability, public bathrooms designed for wheelchair users, or a button that activates automatic doors, and also accessible transit stations. The one in the top right, the accessible icon, this was made as a modification to the International Symbol of Access. Some disability activists advocated for this because they see it as displaying a person with disability who's more active and more engaged. And the one at the bottom, the International Symbol of Acceptance, this one, the idea here is to show that people with disability as equals and that people with disability accept their challenges and even embrace them. So, but they replace the wheel with the heart. So the stigma of the wheelchair is also being removed. And it represents the person, not society's perception of them. This is a symbol that shows an attitude and a lifestyle. It's accepting of one's abilities and rallying around that diversity and turning it into a strength. Okay, developing cultural competence. The United States Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration defines cultural competence as an ongoing process of organizational and individual development that includes learning more about our own and other cultures. It's altering our thinking about culture on the basis of what we learn and changing the ways in which we interact with others to reflect an awareness and sensitivity to diverse cultures. Back in the 90s, the work of psychologists Stanley Su and Daryl Wing Su brought a lot of attention to the importance of cultural competence, which includes cultural considerations in psychotherapy. Culture issues include things related to race, ethnicity, shared beliefs, customs, and values. Not everyone likes the phrase cultural competence because the word competence suggests a mastery or a level of expertise that's been achieved. So some scholars prefer the term cultural humility because cultural competence truly is a lifelong process that requires the clinician to be humble and acknowledge that cultural effectiveness is not something that can be fully mastered because cultural norms change often, and the intersectionality of our clients' identities are so complex and dynamic, and it also changes for them. The cultural competence is an endless process of shifting power differentials, and it requires a fundamental change in the way people think about, understand, and interact with the world around them. Being culturally humble means accepting that we have an active, lifelong responsibility and commitment to self-reflection. So why is this important? A clinician who is actively working on cultural humility will be more likely to foster a relationship and communication style that's respectful of and responsive to the beliefs, practices, cultural and linguistic needs of the clients that we work with. Intersectionality, the ways in which multiple identities interact, is important for clinicians to consider when working with people with disability. The different cultural groups have distinct beliefs, practices, and values about disability. And people's identification with these various cultural traditions vary, and as clinicians, we cannot assume which ones are more salient. We have to find out from the clients what is more salient to them. So for example, in some cultures, disability may be attributed to supernatural forces. And a clinician or therapist who is culturally humble and competent will want to work with their clients and families in exploring these issues and identify cultural factors that can be used as strengths in their rehabilitation and treatment. So the goal is not to change their cultural conception of what disability is or means to them. We should not assume that the Western medical perspective is superior for a particular client. In Western rehabilitation and medicine, the focus is almost always on helping clients to achieve independence, But what does that mean? What is independence? Our definition of independence may be very different from how our clients and their families understand independence. In many non-Western cultures, it's expected that people with disability receive care from family members and that they will live in the home among their immediate or extended family members. In Dr. Andrews' book, there's a great line that says that clinicians should remember that independence and autonomy are not synonymous. A desire to change. The Center for Community Health and Development describes cultural awareness as openness to attitudinal change. So one cannot achieve cultural humility without a willingness to engage with individuals with diverse identities. Deliberately connecting with clients from different cultural backgrounds and checking our own assumptions and stereotypes will help us develop a more collaborative partnership with the client. Clients respond more favorably when they can sense that the clinician is genuinely enthusiastic about providing culturally competent care. That for us, this is not just a checklist that we have to check off. Self-awareness. Cultural awareness includes self-examination. We need to be aware of our own cultural and personal biases, the prejudices and assumptions we have about people from other groups. We need to own it by examining our experiences of privilege and oppression. Part of this includes acknowledging the inherent power differential between the client and you as the therapist and clinician. And think about what you write in your documentation, the progress notes and reports, the admission and discharge notes that you write. This information becomes a permanent part of a client's medical record, right? And it gets passed to various providers and agencies. Think about the language in your notes. If your client reads your notes, how do you think they would feel? Would they feel judged? Would they be slighted? Would they feel respected? Would they feel understood? When clients are labeled as refusing or non-compliant to treatment, do we include information on the various factors why the client is declining? For example, if a client is no-showing, sometimes it's referred to as an indication of non-adherence to treatment. What if there are transportation, financial, and social barriers for the client to show up for the appointment? For clients who rely on medical transportation, but if they also have cognitive deficits that make it difficult for them to plan ahead and make the reservations ahead of time, but not too far ahead, because a lot of medical transportations have rules that you can only make the reservation X number of hours prior to the appointment, and they don't have the adequate support to make these reservations, and that's why they were not able to come to the appointment. Or they did make the reservation, but the medical transportation service may be late in picking them up. Also, if they have to rely on home health aides or personal care attendants to get ready for the appointment, and then maybe the PCA was late or did not show up that morning, would your client have means to get ready, be able to transfer out of bed, and then come to the appointment? So self-awareness includes criticizing the way we interact with others, but in a constructive manner. Many of us are either unaware or unable to acknowledge our implicit biases. Can we appreciate cultural differences without passing judgment? This is not an easy process. And even when you think about if we have, not just like when we have contact with family members whose beliefs and cultural attitudes about disability may be more negative, or they're hesitant to provide resources in caring for a disabled family member, this may elicit negative thoughts and feelings in the clinician. Many of us work in this profession because we tend to have a more nurturing side, but it's important to suspend the judgment and take a non-threatening and inquisitive stance. When we do that, we would be better able to understand the different cultural factors and then provide additional education in a gentle, sensitive, and respectful manner that will increase the odds of forming a collaborative partnership with the family members or the caretakers that ultimately will improve and positively impact the lives of our clients. It's also important for clinicians to learn fundamental information about culturally mediated health-related beliefs and culture values, the incidence and prevalence of the diagnosis that you're working with, and the effectiveness of the treatment. This is different from stereotyping. Having such knowledge and information will help the clinician make a more individualized assessment of the client, taking into account the culture, the life experiences of the client, and acculturation issues. Now, are there specific health-related practices, attitudes, and behaviors common for that diagnosis? For example, a physician, in addition to knowing the possible adverse reactions to medications or procedures, must also be aware of how this may personally affect the person. If tubal ligation or hysterectomy is being recommended, it would be prudent for the physician to be aware of the historical involuntary sterilization of disabled women and whether the client's ethnicity has also been impacted by this historically. What cultural factors contribute to underreporting of symptoms or underutilization of services? And then skill development. Cultural skill development refers to the clinician's ability to obtain all of this relevant information about the client's cultural identities so we can foster a respectful collaboration and then to also select appropriate treatments. A theme present in all of this is really being person-centered. A person-centered interviewing style recognizes the client as the expert about their own cultural realities. This is the hallmark of cultural humility. The clinician needs to be able to listen attentively, be open to other cultures, and most importantly, be fully present in the moment. As it became clear that disability was not a strictly model concept or a strictly social concept, there was a movement toward combining these concepts into a biopsychosocial model. So in the 1970s, these concepts were being developed, and the World Health Organization released the International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities, and Handicaps that classified disability into 3 domains: impairment, disability, and handicap. Impairments were defined as abnormalities of the body structure, appearance, and or the organ system and function. Disabilities were defined as the consequence of impairments in terms of functional performance and activity of the individual. The handicaps were defined as the disadvantages experienced by the individual as a result of the impairments and disabilities. So this is a biopsychosocial model that incorporates trends from other models of disability. It promotes the idea of universalism, that disability is a fully human trait. So in this model, the term functioning includes the body structure and functions at the organ system level, the activities at the individual level, and participation at the societal level. The term disability includes impairment, activity limitation, and participation restriction. The contextual factors include external environmental factors and internal personal factors. The ICF puts emphasis on health and functioning rather than the disability. So this is an example. If we're working with somebody who is now aging with a disability, they're aging and then coupled with the disability that they have may be affecting their sensory motor and cognition. And it then also affects their physical activity, their ability to exercise, their ability for self-feeding and grooming, which may impact the quality of life, the self-report measures of self-esteem and self-care, and the different contextual factors. You also want to look at, well, how accessible is their home and their community or their work setting? What's their age, weight, height, gender, the duration of the impairment, and an ethnicity in conceptualizing the case. I want to talk about the disability affirmative therapy that Dr. Olkin wrote about. This is a case formulation template that incorporates disability without overemphasizing or minimizing it. This is not a treatment or manualized set of procedures, but rather more of an approach to how we conduct therapy. It's really about the clinician's self-examination of our own attitudes about people with disability. This is a prequel for us to effectively implement a disability affirmative therapy style. So disability affirmative therapy has 2 main components. First, it involves a series of 9 areas to be explored with a client or family with disability, and we will be talking about that in subsequent slides. And these 9 areas are designed to cover the various aspects of disability experiences for the specific individual or family. The goal of this exploration is to help us come up with a case formulation or conceptualization that does not underestimate or overinflate the role of disability in a person's life and their presenting problems. Now, sometimes too often the disability is seen as a defining characteristic that it overshadows other important aspects of the individual. and all of the individual's problems are seen through the lens of disability. The purpose of this approach is to help the clinicians, together with the client, focus the lens appropriately to view disability in the proper perspective. The second component of DAT is the stance of the therapist. This stance involves taking a constructivist view of disability. That is, disability is a social construct, and adopting the World Health Organization's biopsychosocial model of disability that we just talked about, where disability is viewed as a naturally occurring phenomenon that will always exist. So a good fit between the therapist case formulation and the client self-understanding is important in achieving positive outcomes in therapy. The disability affirmative therapy approach should facilitate mutual understanding of the key aspects of the disability experience, and then the role that these experiences have in the client's current functioning, their presenting problems, and their relationships. So this is not, a theory of therapy, but really a process for understanding a given client that we're working with. To be a good disability affirmative therapist, one first needs to be a good therapist. So this does not dictate how to treat the client, what interventions to apply, the order of interventions, when or how, or if to use any specific techniques, or how to modify the homework, or what the goals of therapy should be. These aspects of treatment are guided still by the clinician's own theoretical orientation and training. So I have a few videos that I think would help illustrate the approach in working with persons with disability. The first video talks also about the person-first language. So this is something more nuanced in the disability community. There are, there's the person-first language, and then there's the identity-first language. It's really important to ask your client what their preference is. There are some specific disability communities where they prefer the person first. And then, for example, in the autism community, there's a preference for identity first language. And it's also regional. Some countries it's person first, some prefer the identity first. The APA publication manual for a long time adopted the person first language, but I believe that there has been a recent recognition of the nuance of this, and then the next publication when it comes out will be addressing the use of both for person first and identity first languages as acceptable. This video will also talk about the different models of disability.
What is person-first language? Person-first language puts the person ahead of any disability identifier, meaning a person who has autism or a person with an intellectual disability. Why is this important? A person with a disability is a person first. People with disabilities do not want to be seen first and foremost by their disability. It devalues their inherent uniqueness and personhood. Additionally, a person who uses an assistive device is not bound by it. A person who uses a wheelchair, for example, is much freer to move around this world because of their chair. This stems from the social model of disability. A person is disabled by lack of access to their community and environment, not their impairment. Another common model is the medical model, which typically sees the person from a diagnostic point of view. Another common model is the charity model. This posits interventions or policies are done in the best interests of the person with a disability without including them or their experiences in the decision-making process. Also, using terms such as special, mentally retarded, handicapped, are disrespectful and possibly hurtful. Always ask the person how they choose to identify, but default to person-first language if you don't know.
The second video is a brief clip from a TV show called Speechless, and this is an illustration of one of the attitudinal barriers that we talked about, like the hero worship or inspiration porn.
Hey, are you friends with the Donald Bronson?
Who?
That's what I thought. He gave a whole speech about how you're his hero. He said you're the bravest guy he knows, you make him a better person.
Now I'm someone else's speech? Stupid INS inspiration porn? What's that?
It's a portrayal of people with disabilities as one-dimensional saints who only exist to warm the hearts and open the minds of able-bodied people.
I blame Tiny Tim.
It's terrible, but it's great for winning essay contests, damn it. I'm over here trying to sell Albert Einstein.
Hey, it's not Donald's fault you picked Einstein. Come on, man, put it away. Let's talk to Donald. Sounds good. Einstein is my hero. He was a lowly patent clerk. Come on, dude.
Fatigue? Is sleep affected? Is there danger of falling? What's the degree of uncertainty about the future course of the diagnosis, and whether the disability implies a shortened life expectancy? Dr. Olkin included helpful questions to ask about the person's disability when you are doing your assessment. So what's the nature of your disability? When were you diagnosed? How were you diagnosed? What was your family's reaction to the diagnosis? How does it affect you in your daily life? Do you experience pain or fatigue? If yes, where, how often, how severe, and I think most importantly, how often does it prevent you from doing the things that you want or have to do? So you're assessing the impact of the pain and the fatigue in the person's daily functioning. Have you fallen in the past year? What aspects about the diagnosis or the disability do you find most troubling? What's the probable course of the condition over time? So even if as a clinician, you know what the probable course of this diagnosis is, it's also helpful to understand what the client's understanding is of the course of the condition. Are there any expected changes in your life expectancy because of this diagnosis? And I love this next one. What are the positive aspects associated with your disability? So pain, unfortunately, is a common experience with many of the clients that we work with in the rehabilitation world. And it's important to assess, how does pain affect their functioning? There's not much of a focus on pain reduction because sometimes, chronic pain is part of their life, but it's helping them focus on how do you retain the retention of the functions and the activities that they value despite the pain. So there are evidence-based non-pharmacological interventions to address chronic pain. Cognitive behavioral therapy is one, using mindfulness, distraction techniques, cognitive restructuring about their pain beliefs, using graded activity and pacing. When you are using mindfulness techniques or other exercises that focus in inward experiences, some clients may not want that because they feel like it only increases their awareness of pain. However, learning how to make the pain recede is a valuable skill, so encourage the client to continue with the exercises. Also, if you're working with individuals with amputation, and some of the recorded or canned mindfulness exercises that you find online may have a lot of steps that includes limbs and other body parts that may not be comfortable with them. So it's always good to check in with them. If that's something that they will not respond to, then one of the things that you can do is really ask what their preference are, and then you collaboratively create a script together that you can record, and then they can listen to that outside of the sessions. Also thinking about the risk-benefit ratio of the activity. So if, for example, gardening is something that your client really enjoys, but it increases their back pain, but the client may still feel but it's worthwhile because it makes me feel good about myself and it makes me enjoy the day. So work with your client in coming up with steps to reduce the degree of pain when they're doing that activity. So, maybe they can use raised garden beds or use stools with wheels, or perhaps work on some gardening activities where they can sit at a table, sit and work on it at a table. It's also helpful to ask questions about the client's beliefs about their illness and medication use. So asking what illnesses did they have as a child, and what happened in their family when they were ill? How did people react? Were there any family remedies that were used? Did the family use prayers, chicken soup, hot baths, cold compress to help the person feel better? Did the parent let your client stay home from school when they were sick? Did they send them to school anyway? Was it ever a fun thing to stay home from school? I know during the COVID era, you may have, a runny nose because of the allergies, and especially in the beginning, people would ask you to stay home anyway. Asking, were there specific things parents did for you when you were sick? Like, did they read to you? Did they fluff your pillows and change your sheets? Let you watch TV, give you special foods? Like, what kind of attention would they get when they were ill? How quick were the parents to give medications? What were the beliefs about what caused a disability? Did they think it was related to some virus, stress, poor lifestyle habits, a divine punishment or superstition? And then were those beliefs consistent with the culture? And which were the same, which were different? And what were their beliefs, or what are their beliefs about prescribed medications and over-the-counter medications? And what does wellness mean to them? It's also important to address and talk about substance use and misuse. Substance use contributes to a higher probability of disability, and substance use prior to the disability or pre-injury or pre-morbid is really the best predictor of substance use post-disability. For individuals who are dealing with both a medical or psychiatric disability and substance abuse, they really could benefit from support in helping them access treatment, because many substance abuse focused rehab treatment clinics or centers may not be accessible to persons with various disabilities because of their medical complexities, like if they have seizures, if they need assistance transferring from the wheelchair to the bathroom, for example, they're less likely to find treatment. And then for many individuals with physical disability, many of the rehabilitation centers also don't specialize in substance abuse, and so they kind of get caught in between and may fall through the cracks. If you think about some of the population that we work with, for example, individuals who've sustained spinal cord injuries or traumatic brain injuries, you know, some of those injuries were sustained from accidents related to driving or sports related or gunshot wounds. And so sometimes like that kind of population has a higher risk of substance use prior to their injury. Unemployment is also higher among people with disability, and so with unemployment, the day is less structured, there are fewer restrictions on behavior and greater isolation, and these are all risk factors for substance use disorders. The medications prescribed for disability symptoms are also subject to misuse and addiction, like pain medication, benzos. One of the assessment tools that's really helpful, like a quick and easy way to assess, is the CAGE questionnaire. You want to ask, have you ever felt that you should cut down on your drinking or the substance use? Have you ever felt annoyed by someone criticizing your drinking? Have you ever felt guilty about your drinking? Have you ever had a drink first thing in the morning to steady your nerves to get rid of a hangover? Falls. Fear of falling can affect rehab participation, mobility, and general activity level, which can lead to depression. It's not necessary to have experienced an actual fall to develop a fear of falling, right? And that fear leads to changes in their behavior, which may reduce their mobility, the number of trips that they take outside the house or when they travel. And when activities are reduced, this can lead to depression or feelings of isolation. It's helpful to explore your client's beliefs and feelings about using assistive technology and also their financial resources, because if they are a fall risk, but they may have beliefs that interfere with their embrace of these assistive technology devices, but it increases the risk of falls, it's important to address those things. So fear of falling is more complicated than it sounds. It's a person's belief in their own ability to perform a task safely without losing balance or falling. However, it's even more than just having the confidence to do something. A fear of falling involves real anxiety and can result in physical sensations associated with fear, such as nausea and palpitations. For other people, the fear of falling appears after a fall, but it can also affect people who have never had falls, but maybe they experience dizziness or balance issues or difficulty walking. It's important to address this because it can lead to avoidance of activities, which in turn causes a person to move less, become more sedentary, and then they become less fit, and they may lose their strength, their mobility, balance, and endurance. And then this puts the individual at further risk of fall. So this sets up a vicious cycle of falling and fear. Using assistive technology devices, explore the psychosocial implications of using the devices. It's helpful for a clinician to be familiar with the different assistive technology devices. If you are not a PT or RT, you don't have to be an expert, but it's still helpful to at least like know what those are. There is often a value hierarchy in ATs and the disability community. So for example, using one crutch is better than two, crutch is better than a walker or scooter, and that's better than a manual wheelchair, and a manual wheelchair is better than an electric chair. So, you know, all devices may carry a psycho-emotional baggage for the clients that you work with. So some people may not want to use a walker because they may have a perception, oh, that's for old people and I'm too young to be using that. One of the things that the literature shows that early adoption of assistive devices allows that device to become part of the self-definition of the person or their body image. So if they started using it at an earlier age, they're more likely to embrace this than people who had to learn how to use that later on in their life. So sometimes sowing seeds over a period of months can be helpful, like asking your clients, did you use your assistive device today? And then if they said no, I don't want to use it, you don't have to pursue the topic immediately, but maybe kind of tuck in the back of your mind. And then when there's an opportunity that like a social opportunity, for example, and then they felt really, really tired after that, then you can kind of bring up like, that might have been mitigated if you used a walker or you used a wheelchair as a way to increase their motivation to use that. It's also helpful to ask about the developmental history of the disability, asking about their experiences, the type of onset. Is the disability a congenital? Did it happen early? Was it traumatic? Childhood hospitalizations, was there a period of separation from the parents? If the injury was traumatic, did it involve injuries of other people, that like family members, for example? Were there subsequent surgeries? Was there re-traumatization from the surgeries? Did your client think the surgery was successful? Who told them about the surgery? How far in advance? How did they react to the news? Did anyone stay with them? How long were they in the hospital? What happened after the surgery? How long before they were able to go back to school or work? Did they think the surgery was successful? What were their expectations about the surgery? Also asking about abuse. And in working with people with disability, the abuse doesn't always have to be a direct physical abuse. It could be a form of intimidation. For example, like removing batteries from electric wheelchairs, or not charging it, or refusing to help someone transfer out of a toilet, or leaving them sitting there unnecessarily longer than what's comfortable or needed. Like not activating the automatic door openers, or manipulating their medications, refusing to help them with feeding and cutting their food or preparing the food. When they were at school, were they placed in like a slower class, or was there social segregation? Were they often the last person selected for teams? Because these experiences can leave lasting remarks on their self-esteem. Did anyone advocate for them? Did they advocate for themselves? And it's helpful to ask these questions, because the more you understand about their experiences with these, the better you will be able to understand what their model of disability is. So the models of disability provides a framework for the clinicians to understand the complex relationship among the individual, their disability, and the outcomes at both the personal and societal level. It reflects your client's beliefs about the causes of disabilities, the appropriate remedies, and the meaning of the disability for them. So you're taking into account the person and their family's beliefs and values about it. So knowing your client's model of disability informs you as a therapist how to talk to your client about it, what words to use, the beliefs that they have about it, and various aspects of that disability, not just theirs, but their family as well. So the moral model of disability views disability as a punishment inflicted upon the individual or family by an external force. Like it can be due to misdemeanors committed by the person or someone in their family, or even their ancestors. Like birth conditions can be due to actions committed in a previous reincarnation, for example. So sometimes the presence of evil spirits is used to explain differences in behaviors, especially in psychiatric conditions. They may have beliefs about acts of exorcism or sacrifice as things that can be helpful in reducing the negative influence of the diagnosis. So in some cases, the disability stigmatizes a whole family, like it lowers their status or even leads to social exclusion in the community. The medical model of disability equates pathology with inherent disability. So, for example, if a person with hearing loss is considered disabled, just the same way that they view having cancer as a disability. And in the medical model, the disability is viewed as a defect that the field of medicine and healthcare professionals must fix or cure. A solely medical model of disability may lead to any individual with a sense of having a pathology, however severe it may be, which can result in institutionalization or stigmatization of the individual. The social model of disability it looks at disability in an environmental context. So, for example, a person with hearing loss is not disabled by the hearing loss itself, but by the environment not providing appropriate resources for that person. So this type of model was pioneered mostly by individuals who themselves been labeled as having the disability by the medical models of disability. The context and intersectionality. So, there really is an interplay of disability and so many demographic variables, like you're understanding the socioeconomic status of your client. There is the disability and poverty are inextricably linked. When you think about the chronic illness and work disability account for about half the defaults on mortgages. Many people with disability, it's harder for them to find employment or stay in that job longer. The options decrease for them to remain working as they age and as the disability affect the body. So there tends to be a higher unemployment rate among people with disability. And then there's also the conversion disadvantage. So when they are working and they're earning an income, there's a need to convert a chunk of that income into things that would help them in their day-to-day. So like a percent of that income goes directly into out-of-pocket payments for like housing or car modifications, or paying for their caregivers or prosthetics or shoe or clothing alterations, and other repairing assistive technologies. Understanding disability culture and community. So it is helpful to have knowledge of an interface with this culture and community. There was a recent article that came out in The Guardian about a woman who, she's in her early 20s, and she was just walking down the street, and a man who wanted to end his life jumped up a building and fell on top of her. And as a result, she sustained an incomplete spinal cord injury. And she, in this article, talked about her physical and psychological journey and process of how she dealt with the rehabilitation, how she dealt with the pre and post-injury identity. And it's a great example of disability identity development and disability pride. So she started a podcast called This Is Spinal Crap. I haven't had the chance to listen to it, but the title alone, I think, warrants a listen. But this is something that many people in the disability community talk about, like having this sense of pride and being able to connect with other individuals with disability, being able to go to camps, for example, because there is a sense of like when they start having social interactions with other people with disability, like they feel like I don't have to explain it, they just get it. And also understanding some of the disability norms, for the group that your client belongs to. And then microaggressions. These are unintended slights or social cues by members of a dominant group to members of minority groups about their minority group status. It's about dealing with people's reactions and behaviors that can be as difficult as managing physical limitations. The experiences of microaggressions that your client has and their response to these experiences would be helpful to address in your treatment. There are many different types of microaggressions. It could be environmental, like creation of spaces that are not accessible to them, or accessible but very inconvenient. So if there is an accessible door, but it's like all the way around in the back of the building, or there is a curb cut, but it's like all the way at the end of the block, or there's a door but it's heavy. Narrow aisles in stores where wheelchairs or walkers won't fit. It's like, these kinds of architectural barriers are reminding people with disability of their minority status and that they're separate from the rest of the community. It could also be verbal microaggressions, like downplaying the effect of disability, saying things like, oh, but you look fine. And even sometimes like the way we ask questions or the type of questions that we ask may be a form of verbal microaggression. So for example, if you're assessing somebody who was in a car accident, if you ask like, were you wearing a seatbelt, there might be an implicit message of blame that they did something that caused their injury.
Top 5 disability etiquette mistakes. If we're not used to dealing with disabled people, we may feel awkward when we come across someone with a disability. We may not know how best to help them, and we might cause offense without meaning to.
How did you come in? A train, bus?
I drove, actually.
Oh, well done. You have your car modified so you can drive it?
Yes, I had it especially shrunk to fit. A lot of the time, we worry unnecessarily. For example, it's perfectly all right to say, I don't see why, when talking to a blind or visually impaired person. But there are some common mistakes that non-disabled people make when dealing with disabled people. And here are 5 of the most common. Number 1, taking a blind or visually impaired person's arm.
Would you like me to guide you to the refund desk? We can sort it out there.
Oh, thank you.
Would you like to take my elbow?
Right.
Most people actually prefer to take your arm, not the other way around. So don't grab a person to guide them. Instead, offer your arm if they need it, and be sure to warn them of any obstacles.
If you'd like to give me your hand, I'll put it on the back of the chair for you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Number 2, shouting at someone with a hearing impairment.
You got to give it a good thump. It gets stuck.
Shouting doesn't make us easier to understand. In fact, it distorts our faces, and it can make it harder for people with a hearing impairment to lip read. So just speak at your normal speed and volume, and make sure that the person can see you.
It's broken. You're going to have to go down to the 2nd floor. There's another machine there.
Number 3, talking to guide dogs before their owners.
People always ask me where my dog is. Where's your dog? They stop me in the street and ask me where my dog is. It's bizarre.
We all love dogs, but it's rude to speak to and fuss over a guide dog before addressing its owner.
Oh, he's lovely. What's his name?
Fang.
Fang.
I'm only joking. It's Malcolm, really.
So always talk to the person, not the dog. Number 4, standing up when talking to a wheelchair user. A wheelchair user will soon get a stiff neck from looking up at someone who's standing. So try to get down to a similar level. They won't think you're being condescending, and they'll be much more comfortable. Number 5, assuming you know how to help.
It's electric.
We may not always be the best judge of how to help someone who's disabled. So if in doubt, just ask.
Oh, sorry, did I get you?
No, it's okay, I'm fine.
I knew I shouldn't have had that last vodka.
Learn the practical steps you need to take when serving disabled customers and working with disabled colleagues with disability confident training from Skill Boosters.
It's also helpful to find out from your client how the disability is affecting their current social interactions. Following a significant injury, a traumatic injury, such as spinal cord injury or traumatic brain injury that may require months of hospitalization and rehabilitation treatment, it may affect their availability, right? Like their time availability to interact with their friends, because much of their time is going to therapies. And then also, like sometimes with a significant injury, their life experiences begin to diverge from their peers. And so finding out how those things affect their perceptions of their self-esteem, their sense of worth, and their feelings about the future would be helpful. And also, like when they're out in public, children are prone to stare or point. Kids say the darndest thing. They may ask questions that are impolite because they're curious or they truly don't understand. They can be overly candid. So helping your client understand how that impacts them and how they respond to these kinds of things. Affective prescription. So when people impose beliefs about what the disability should feel like for people with disability, saying that, kind of assuming what emotions they're supposed to have, or having an assumption that disability is a tragedy, a loss full of suffering, or a period of mourning. That's not often the case. Depression is not always correlated with the severity of the injury or disability. but may be more likely related to previous history of depression, pain level, their sleep quality, fatigue, or experiences of discrimination. In the disability community, using the kubleros stages of grief, people have different feelings about that, because it's not like this is, it's for them, it's not necessarily like a feeling of dying, but more of just a reaction to adjusting to now new norms for them. And the absence of depression is not necessarily denial. Sometimes individuals may experience what we call like adaptive denial, especially right after the injury, which can be helpful. That's why it's called adaptive. Also assessing their families and intimate relationships. Parents with disabilities, like when sometimes they have to ask their kids for help, or kids kind of take on some of the caregiving role. There are ways that we can assess any concerns about exploitation, abuse, or neglect there, which I'll talk about in the next few slides. But also like really recognizing that people with disability also have sexual health. They are not asexual beings. And it's important to be able to address and talk about that, and be able to provide them the resources that they need. So areas to assess and evaluating tasks children might do for a parent with disability, and these are areas that I got from Dr. Olkin's book. It would be helpful to find out the age and developmental level of the child being asked to perform the task. What's the nature of the task? How time consuming, how arduous is it, and how unpleasant? And also the symbolic meaning. Is it related to toileting or dressing? Does it involve the opposite gender parent? Does the task cause any pain or discomfort to the parent that the child is now also experiencing and watching and observing their parent be in pain as they're doing this task? What's the frequency? How often does the child need to perform this task? Is the child the only person responsible for this task? And what's the consequence if the child does not perform this? Is it going to be life-threatening? Will it cause the parent significant pain or discomfort or reduce mobility? What's the degree of support that the child has in performing this task? And the relationship of the child to the person for whom the task is performed? What's the role of the other able-bodied members in the house? The time of day or night that the task must be completed, the total number of the tasks that the child has to complete, and any positive benefits to the child performing the task. So this is a summary of the disability affirmative therapy template that we talked about. For anybody doing psychotherapy, these are some suggested accommodations that one can make, including like shorter sessions, having short breaks to accommodate fatigue, and also just like cognitive capacity. Be flexible appointment times to accommodate fatigue. Some people prefer late afternoon, some people prefer earlier in the day, because by late afternoon they feel like they've crashed. Giving appointment reminders for people with memory difficulties. Making available things, physical things that can provide comfort, such as blankets or pillows. I find that it's really helpful to provide visual aids and summarizing or recapping the sessions, and also simplifying the information. So for example, like if your client prefers auditory modality as their preferred way of learning, you don't have to record the entire session, because that's kind of long. It could be a 45 to 60-minute session. But maybe toward the end, recap the session in a few sentences and record that. So that's something that they can listen to throughout the week. Or if you're going to use relaxation exercises and you came up with a script, you can record that while you're doing that in session. So then the client can also access that throughout the week. And then writing a summary of, what's the most important thing that they learned from today's session? What's their takeaway? And then also writing down what the therapy homework is. Often when I see outpatients, I would have kind of like a therapy report, like that we would write, like we would recap the session in like 2 bullet points, a summary of the therapy homework, and then also a reminder when their next appointment would be, and then the important contact information, such as a crisis number or then my office number. And then simplifying information. So if you want to use cognitive behavioral therapy thought records or worksheets, there are resources out there that have simplified versions. So for example, the cognitive processing therapy worksheets visually is less overwhelming than some of the more traditional CBT thought record worksheets. providing more structure and less abstraction, especially if you're working with clients who could benefit from cognitive accommodations. Clearly outlining the treatment course and expectations, how many sessions, how long are the sessions, if there's PTSD treatment involved, like, kind of really helping them understand that there might be some sessions that could be emotionally more salient for them, and involving their social supports. If they have family members or caregivers or significant others, that would be helpful, of course, with your client's permission. They could be your therapy partners in helping them practice these techniques outside of the sessions, or reminding them and giving them prompts to use these techniques, or reminding them to, like, oh, this is something that would be helpful for you to write down so you can remember to talk about them in your next therapy session. The utilization of telehealth. I think, one of the positive things that came out of the pandemic is that it made telehealth much more accessible to a lot of people. And this is really a helpful resource for people with disability because of the different barriers that we talked about: transportation, having somebody be able to take them to the appointments when they forget their appointments, things like that. And taking a disability affirmative stance is one of the ways that you can accommodate psychotherapy. And these are the references used in this presentation. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Berardinelli. That was wonderful. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. On behalf of Bancroft Neuro Rehab, I would like to thank you for attending the webinar.